Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to our afternoon sessions of the ESI Conference. I'm Marcia Lacco, the Environmental Assistance Section Chief with the Division of Environmental Assistance and Customer Service. Hopefully everyone's been with us the last 2.5 days. You've become familiar with GoToWebinar. Probably the biggest thing you need to remember is to use that red arrow at the top to hide and shrink your control panel so that you can see the entire screen of those that are presenting. And so I'm just going to roll right into our first speaker this afternoon. That is going to be Steve Hall with our Division of Air Quality. He is their Technical Services Section Chief. During his 25 years with the division, Steve has primarily worked as a compliance engineer manager in their technical services section and as a compliance engineer inspector supervisor in their Raleigh regional office. Prior to joining DEQ, Steve worked for 3 years with a private air quality testing and consulting company in Raleigh, and he has an engineering degree from NC State and is a certified public manager. So Steve, I see that you've got your presentation up there. That looks great.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. First thing I need to do is apologize for my video cam. I had a medical procedure yesterday, so I have a big bandage on the side of my head. I didn't time this very well, but if you can just ignore that and follow my slides, this will go very well, I hope. So today's presentation is to give a compliance update from a Division of Air Quality perspective. The topics to be covered are the look back at 2019, some of the last full calendar year, some of the compliance and enforcement activities in DAQ, some of the common air quality violations we cited, some compliance tips for environmental managers that I hope you find helpful, a summary of DAQs, or really DEQs, and specifically DAQ's tiered enforcement policy, and then some information on compliance and enforcement activities during the COVID-19 pandemic and some resources that may help you towards the end. And if you have questions during the course of the presentation, just write them into the chat, and we'll be glad to take questions at the end, and should have plenty of time for that. So the first thing to talk about is just our inspection activities, comparing 2019 to the previous 4 years. These numbers on the slide are our current facilities that are permitted as either Title V or major facilities, synthetic minors, which are those in between. They could be major, but the facilities that take a limit in their air quality permit to be a minor facility, and then permitted small facilities, which another small is a equivalent term to minor. And so you can see the numbers here of what we have. We also have a few registered facilities in North Carolina that and some permit exempt facilities that we target for inspections. Usually these are facilities that used to have an air quality permit but qualified for exemption under some recent changes in session law through the legislature. So we have a total, if you look at how we do our inspections, we have all our Title V and synthetic minor facilities inspected every year. That's our goal. That's what we try to do. And then we do half of our remaining facilities each year. So we do our small registered and targeted permit exempt every other year, essentially. So we should be, if we're meeting our committals, getting about 1,720 facilities inspected each year. So this slide here is showing how many actual site visits made by DAQ. The vast majority of these are going to be full compliance evaluations, but there will be some visits out there for other reasons, partial compliance evaluations, stack test observations, complaints. Any of those may be in here, but what this shows us is the number of times we're on site as DAQ staff, and therefore we have the opportunity to make a compliance determination at the facility. So when you compare these numbers to the minimum of 1720, you can see if you look at the blue column, the total facility site visits, we're well above what we try to do through 2019. We'll talk a little bit about 2020 in a little while, and those numbers have fallen off for obvious reasons. But back in 2019, pre-COVID, we were still getting out, as we would expect our inspectors to do. And then if you look at just Title V and synthetic minor facilities along the bottom, those have remained fairly steady over the last 5 years. And then this is our violation discovery rate for all those site visits each year. And they held steady between 3% and 3.5% for the first 3 years of this cycle, and then jumped up a little bit in 2018 and fell back down. So this is just any violation that's marked in our system, in our compliance data system, that as the result of a site visit. So if there's a violation, there's going to be some type of letter, and these are 3 types of letter we typically issue in response to our inspection activities, as well as other activities like report reviews, compliance report reviews, emissions inventory reviews, and things we do in the office, any information we get about violations in the office. So, the 3 letters are notices of deficiencies, notices of violations, and notices of recommendations for enforcement. And, when we do issue a notice of recommendation for enforcement, it's usually combined with a notice of violation, but those are separated out here just for the graphic's sake. These are the ones in dark blue are the ones that we intend when we issue the letter to take to civil penalty assessment. The notices of violation are just that, they're a notice, no intent to go to civil penalty assessment. And the notices of deficiencies are more of a reminder of the requirements, and typically involve paperwork, minor types of lapses. And this all falls under our tiered enforcement policy, which we'll discuss in a little bit later. And then here's a look at the actual case assessments. Not all enforcement letters end up going to case assessment. There are reasons and so that they wouldn't, that the regional office may decide based on more information not to pursue civil penalty assessment. There's also cases that are combined into one civil penalty assessment. So there's not a good direct comparison between the previous slide and this slide. But what this slide shows is all civil penalty assessments that's facility related, but also open burning, that our director has to assess civil penalties for those complaint driven cases. And that's generally citizen and small businesses, unpermitted sources doing open burning that we're assessing those civil penalties for. So you can see our caseload has increased over the last few years, and a lot of that's open burning, but even the facility related caseload has increased as well. So what were some of the common violations cited in calendar year 2019? We have violations of federal regulations, and this is not a surprise because some of the federal regulations out there we understand, and anybody who's worked with them understand they're extremely complicated, and so there's a lot of areas that are easy to slip up, and so lots of violations in those categories. I've listed some examples here, but these are certainly not the only examples of new source performance standards or national emission standards for hazardous air pollutant regulations that were violated. So failure to pay annual permit fees, that is something that you'll get an invoice for. So really there's, unless there's a problem with the routing or something, there's a reminder there to pay that invoice, but yet we do have some folks that don't pay on time. Late submittal of permit required reports or report required by regulation, failure to conduct permit required monitoring and record keeping, and violations of some type of avoidance condition, whether it be synthetic mine or otherwise, and then general duty to properly operate and maintain the plant equipment at all times to minimize air pollution. So, and then air toxics rules violations, state only air toxics rule violations. All right, my screen's locked up. There we go. So given this set of violations, and the list for 2019 is similar to what we see for the last several years, what are some tips that can help you that can help environmental managers with their air quality compliance? It starts with the permitting process, and that starts with knowing when you need a permit. And 2D 0101 talks about constructing, operating, modifying a permit, and when you need to do that. Whether if there's an applicable standard, if there's a regulated pollutant that is emitted and there's not otherwise an exemption under 2Q0102. I think that's first one's supposed to be 2Q0101. That's a typo there with the 2D. But then once you figure out whether you need a permit, you need to decide what type of permit, and the 2Q300 rules, a whole set of rules, are the permitting requirements for small and synthetic minor facilities. And the 2Q500 rules are the state permit requirements for Title V facilities. So those are, those are rules you'd want to be familiar with depending on your facility classification. So I always like to say that the #1 rule of air quality compliance starts with the permit and a clear reading and understanding, careful reading, clear understanding of the requirements of your permit. And then the #2 rule is to make sure that you're not the only one at your facility who understands the requirements of your air permit. And the reason for that is you can know everything inside and out, but if you're not available when the compliance inspector shows up, the inspection process can get ugly really quickly. And so make sure that as the primary environmental manager, you're familiar with, as you can be, with the requirements, but share that knowledge and kind of what to expect during an air quality inspection with your colleagues, at least a couple who would likely be available in your absence. So here are some tips. Starts with what we just said. Pay in close particular attention to specific testing, monitoring, record keeping, reporting requirements, because that's where a lot of folks can slip up. When you're reading your permit, including the draft versions of your air quality permit, ask yourself if the permit correctly summarizes the requirements of the regulations. So not only know your permit, but know the underlying regulations. When they're referenced, go back to the regulations, say, does this make sense? Is this correctly summarizing the regulatory requirements? If not, contact us and we can modify the permit as needed. Consider specific ways that you could prove compliance with each permit condition should an inspector show up on site and ask you, how do you know you're going to compliance with this condition? Think about ahead of time what you would say and what records you might provide. It's always good to create a self-auditing program so that you can kind of go through all your records, all your processes, go through the permit, making sure you can prove compliance on your own before a inspector shows up. And it's good to have regular walkthroughs for things like visible emissions, fugitive emissions, and objectionable odors to make sure none of those are becoming an issue at your plant. Reliable reminder systems for permit required due dates are important. Also, keeping orderly records in an easily accessible location. Having them is one thing, but being able to present them immediately for the inspector to review and having them accessible is another thing, but both are important. And then designating those reliable backups who can fill in as needed. And always, we'll have contact information at the end of this presentation, but always look to contact either DAQ or an experienced air quality consultant if you have any questions along the way. So what happens when there is a violation? Some things to keep in mind. First of all, come clean. Let us know about it. Don't try to cover it up. An honest mistake is a civil enforcement matter, as with what we talked about earlier with the civil penalty assessments. Potentially, it may just be a notification, but a cover-up becomes a criminal matter, and we don't want to go there, none of us. So be careful with unrealistic company policies about air quality, about environmental compliance. Air quality programs are run by humans, and as humans, we all make mistakes, and we sometimes find ourselves trying to be consistent as a regulatory agency in how we address violations at different facilities, similar violations at different facilities. And then we have folks coming to us say, but our policy, our corporate policy doesn't allow any NOVs. Well, that's problematic from mostly on the company side, because we are responsible for being fair and equitable with all our companies, regardless of what their policy are. So a violation of a certain type should result in the same response, regardless of company policy. So just be aware of that, and make those who make those decisions in your company aware of that. Understand that DAQ is obligated to take action when we discover violations. And when we don't, that can become problematic, either from an EPA oversight standpoint or third-party lawsuits that can also seek enforcement remedies, especially if DAQ does not take action. All right, let's talk a little bit about tiered enforcement. This came out of a session law change in 2011, and but DAQ really has always had a tiered approach to enforcement. We've just expanded it a little bit with this and defined it a little better with this session law change, which required the department to develop a uniform policy for the notification of deficiencies and violations. That's quoted in the session law. And some other DEQ divisions had already been issuing notices of deficiency prior to this session law. DAQ did not prior to that, and one of the things that happened as a result of this session law is we added that tier for notice of deficiency to our enforcement program. So the uniform policy, or the tiered enforcement policy, was to establish different types of notification based on the potential or actual level of harm to public health, the environment, and the natural resources of the state. That's the intent. Oops. Okay, so the session law required DEQ to review notification policies of the US EPA and the Environmental Regulatory Program of other states. Also, a final report was due in October 2011 back to the legislature, and DEQ was required to implement this new policy by February of 2012. DEQ's tiered enforcement policy was actually finalized in September of 2011. So DEQ's tiered enforcement policy recognizes and documents in the policy itself that some level of program autonomy is necessary because individual programs operate under different statute and rules, and there is some uniqueness to the different divisions' policies. But each agency was required to come up with a three-tiered approach to enforcement based on the severity of the violation, and the response should increase in severity with the severity of the offense. So the first tiered is a notice of deficiency, and this is for first-time record keeping or paperwork lapses that result in little or no harm to the environment or public health. The second tier is the issuance of a notice of violation for repeat or more serious first-time infractions that could result in harm to environment or public health. So keep in mind, I mean, the first time for a simple paperwork, no harm type of lapse is an NOD, but if it happens a second time, it goes up a tier to an NOV. If it happens a third time, then it falls into that tier 3 for notice of recommendation for enforcement. But also under that third tier, you can have first-time violations that clearly impact the environment or public health. So a few things that are not covered under the tiered enforcement policy are administrative orders, special order by consents, and judicial actions for injunctive release. These actions are intended to address immediate threats to public health, safety, and the environment, or to address a continuing violation. And they have their own statutory criteria that DEQ follows. So looking at some data again of the different letter types, notices of deficiency, notices of violations, and notice of recommendation for enforcement, and this over a 10-year period. Remember that the policy went into effect in late 2011. And so we actually issued 12 NODs in 2011, the first that DEQ issued. But the first full year of issuing NODs was in 2012, and you see quite a jump. And then it gradually climbed up to a peak in 2015, and then we start to see a decline and a leveling out through 2019. Conversely, notices of violations were up in the 260, 270 range in 2010-11. After tiered enforcement went to effect, that dropped into the 120s and has steadily increased since that time. And I'm going to show the next slide before I give some potential reasoning. Same thing with notice of recommendations for enforcement. Quite a few back in 2010, dropping off some in 2011 for unknown reasons, but then really dropping off in 2012, 13, 14 as tiered enforcement kind of kicks in, and then steadily increasing back up. So this is a slide that shows all the different letter types together. And you can see as notice of deficiencies increase, the others fell off. All right, so what happens there? We generally look at a 5-year window for an enforcement history. So if someone gets an NOD in year 1 and then gets same incident or similar incident happens in year 2 or 3, then they would fall. Then they, for that second time, they would get an NOV, and then if it happens again within that 5-year window, they would get an NRE. And so even though they had a benefit with that first notice of deficiency, that first offense, it caught up to them with the repeat offenses. So that's why you see some of this leveling out over time. And where a lot of NODs were issued early, some folks lost their opportunity for NODs because of prior offenses, and the enforcement response escalated appropriately. All right, the last thing I'd like to talk about is the COVID-19 pandemic and its impact on compliance and enforcement programs in North Carolina. The first couple of slides are just kind of some key dates. Right about the same time as Governor Cooper issued his first executive order declaring a statewide stay-at-home order effective March 30th and lasting for 30 days, EPA issued some compliance and enforcement, basically what equated to a temporary enforcement policy regarding the COVID-19 impacts on environmental compliance and enforcement programs. So in light of those two things, DEQ issued a press release, which I'll display in a second, giving the department's stance on compliance enforcement activities. And then Governor Cooper issued a series of other orders that either extended the stay-at-home order or moved us into phase 2 or phase 1 and then phase 2, and extending phase 2. And then in late June, OECA, that's the Office of Enforcement and Compliance Assurance for EPA, issued a addendum to terminate their temporary enforcement policy as of August 31st, 2020, which has come and gone now. So, and then we've had Governor Cooper issue extend phase 2 a couple of more times, and just at the beginning of this month moved us into phase 2.5 or phase 2.5 through October 2nd. So, and we just got some news today of potential more restrictions being lifted as we move into the next few weeks. So that's where we are. And the COVID-19 compliance and enforcement response for DEQ was a press release that says, during the current public health crisis, DEQ continues to protect air quality, water quality, and human health under all state environmental rules and regulations. Under our authority, DEQ will work with regulated entities to ensure they remain in compliance, and in instances of non-compliance, pursue enforcement action on a case-by-case basis. So the key to that is case-by-case. And while we appreciate EPA's, their kind of support or insurance that they're not going to overfile for any cases during that time period, unless they're egregious, we had already started talking about our response prior to EPA's notification, and the bottom line was while EPA's temporary enforcement policy confirmed what we already thought we'd be doing, and we appreciated it, we were always going to look at things on a case-by-case basis. And here's what DEQ expected and still expects from regulatory entities related to COVID-19. We expect a good faith effort to comply with air quality regulations. If emission sources are operating, control systems be operating as well. And any excess emissions and accidental release should be reported to us ASAP. We're not excusing excess emissions or accidental releases in any way, shape, or form. So regulatory facilities should follow specific force majeure procedures when they are provided in federal and state regulations. COVID-19 certainly qualifies as a force majeure event, or potentially qualifies, but particularly with regard to stack testing extension requests, there are procedures for requesting those under the federal regulations. DAQ understands that there'll be some unavoidable lapses in compliance activities, such as things like record keeping. And we expect regulated facilities, as soon as they become aware of those things, to let us know about it soon after the restrictions are lifted, that they're able to assess the situation at their facility. And we're available to answer questions. So DAQ is continuing to be open for business, although most of our staff is teleworking. We continue to conduct facility and compliance inspections, both full and partial, following the appropriate safety guidelines, and in some cases using virtual inspection techniques. Things like Zoom calls or Microsoft Team calls, or with the plant personnel and video images from a phone to check out different areas of the plant, or even stack test observations. We continue to do those, and sometimes utilizing virtual observation techniques, but at least a phone call to find out how things are going or what the plans are. We continue to investigate citizen complaints while practicing social distancing, and we are continuing to review any facility compliance reports as we receive them. And as our press release says, we're using enforcement discretion on a case-by-case basis when they are reported to us, but it will always be case-by-case. So looking at our field activity during the COVID-19 period, this is really the graph of the current EPA year. The EPA year starts, and our inspection cycle starts October 1st of each year and ends September 30th. So the top line, the green line on the top left, is full compliance or on-site compliance evaluations. The bottom line are partial inspections, which to a large extent on this graph are going to be off-site inspections. Some of the early ones were probably on-site, but once those numbers get bigger, a lot of them are off-site, telephone calls, maybe using some type of video capability. But you can see that while we were up around well over 100 and approaching 200 inspections a month up through March, on-site full compliance evaluation, that dropped off quickly after the stay-at-home order hit. And in April and May and June were pretty low in terms of full compliance evaluations, while during the same period of time, partial compliance evaluations jumped up. But around June, we issued some internal procedures for getting back out in the field, using necessary precautions and making sure we social distance and making sure that we evaluate the facility's response to COVID-19 before we show up on site, make sure everybody's on the same page. And so we're starting to see those numbers of on-site inspections go back up and the partials drop down. And with one more month to go. So if you need to contact us about anything, we have our website's available. There's a link here in the presentation. Also, the best place to start for your facility-related concerns is the appropriate regional offices. Those offices you can find their information through an interactive map on our website. But here are some phone numbers for the switchboards at all the regional office and the Raleigh Central office. just bear in mind that during this COVID-19 period, you may have to leave a message and have someone get back to you because our phones aren't constantly manned during the COVID-19 period because so many people are teleworking. But we do have people checking messages and forwarding those messages, but sometimes email might be a better way to get up with us during this time. And if you happen to be in Buncombe, Forsyth, or Mecklenburg counties, remember they have their own local programs, and here's the contact information. And those local programs have full authority over the air quality compliance enforcement activities for those areas. So that's it. Here's my contact information if you have any questions after today. But otherwise, I can take any questions you do have today.
There's one question listed here. Are permit fee violations related to the type of payment accepted versus how a company can pay?
I mean, the violations that we cite are generally because after multiple reminders, they just don't pay. It's not a payment method. We do have options for payment as far as, some people still pay by check, but we do have some electronic payment options available. But that usually is, to my knowledge, that's not a factor in the violations. It's just the company didn't pay at all.
There's no other questions listed.
Okay, so Marcia, how are we doing on time?
So it is 2:07, so we're actually a little early for Lori.
Marcia, I actually had a question.
Go ahead, Scott.
So I know that the Haz Waste program has a compliance assistance visit. Is that something that has ever been discussed within DAQ?
Yeah, it comes up from time to time. I think y'all even use a code with EPA that's available. It's not something that we've done officially where we just have a program for compliance assistant visits. But if someone requests something similar to that, pre-COVID, we would, generally we would at least talk with them through their permit, and sometimes even go out in the field and sit down with them and, kind of walk through the permit. But a little difference with DAQ is, we feel strongly like if we were to go out on site and find a violation, we feel an obligation to do something with that violation. We can't ignore it. So we would try to, if they really just wanted us to kind of give them some pointers, we would try to make a point not to do a walkthrough or not to get too deep into the records, just kind of saying stuff like, okay, here's what your permit requires. This is what we'd expect. But, if they start showing us their records and saying, hey, here's what we got, what do you think? And we find a problem, then we would respond with the appropriate compliance enforcement response.
I guess that goes back to your comment, Steve, about each program has leeway in how they, enforce the statutes and regulations that they've been given either from the federal level or from the NC legislature.
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. Each program has autonomy to make those decisions, and what works for one program may not work exactly the same way for another program, but we can definitely learn from each other.
I guess while we've had this little bit of discussion, Steve, I was just wondering, So some of our members had expressed an interest in having our regulatory programs do what's called an announced inspection. Have you guys done any more of that due to COVID? I know DAQ was one of the groups that maybe tended to do more unannounced inspections than announced, if that's a fair way to say it.
Yeah, that's a fair way to say it. And you know, that really comes from our communications with EPA Region 4 on the air quality side. You know, they expect an unannounced inspection when we log our 4 compliance evaluation, and it's an expectation we've always had and we've maintained. Now, there's always been a few exceptions to that, like unmanned locations where you show up and there's nobody there. So it's always best to kind of call ahead in those cases to make sure that somebody can meet you at the site at least. But during COVID-19, we've totally changed that for obvious reasons. I think all our inspections right now, before we go out there, we're going to try to call. There's been a few cases where we have a hard time meeting up with or getting someone contact with somebody or somebody to call us back. And in those cases, we might go out to see what's going on and then try to make contact while we're out there. But by and large, we're calling ahead not only to make sure there's no restrictions as far as us showing up on site, but also to evaluate the company's protocols and procedures for having visitors on site and making sure that we're comfortable, walking around the facility. We don't want to expose anybody at the facility from our staff, and we don't want our staff exposed by any potential situations on the site. So we're just very careful about in a pre-inspection call. But who knows how things will be after COVID? But the expectation would be if we ever get back to some sense of normal, then we would probably go back to unannounced inspections.
Okay. Hey, Keith, did we have any additional questions from the audience?
Okay, there's one additional question. Are there any programs with DEQ that would incentivize an industrial site to convert processes from, say, combustion, which impact air quality, to a cleaner process, possibly electrical?
Speaking from strictly an air quality standpoint, others may have some insight on incentives that I'm not aware of. But the incentive generally from an air quality standpoint generally comes by, if in the example you have, you no longer have to mess with us. We fall out of the picture because, if it's fully electric and there's no combustion sources on site, most likely it's exempt from our permitting requirements, and we no longer inspect those facilities. I can think of an example of one like that where there was a natural gas compressor station that was run by a couple of turbines that eventually, they had a permit for that, and they eventually changed that operation over to all electric, and that facility is kind of totally off our radar now. So there, that won't always be the case. You could be taking a dirtier fuel and switching it over to a cleaner fuel, but and you may still need an air permit. But there's usually, when things like that happen, there's usually less regulatory requirements potentially, and the permits could be much simpler, and the compliance requirements much easier to deal with.
Good to know. And I think we're right on time. So Steve, thank you. That was excellent information.
Thank you very much. Have a good day.
You too. All right, folks, so we're right on schedule. So that means 2:15. We are going to hear from Lori Collins with our State Energy Office. And Lori is an environmental programs consultant, where she focuses on business stakeholder engagement and implementation of North Carolina's Clean Energy Plan and the Climate Risk and Assessment and Resiliency Plan that we're putting in place. Prior to joining us here at DEQ, Lori was Executive Director of the Jules Accelerator, a program to support clean energy startups, and was president of an energy financing venture. Lori has also served in the financial services industry in executive positions at LendingTree, Bank of America, and Fidelity Investments. She holds a Master's of Science in Carbon Management from the University of Edinburgh and an MBA from Kellogg at Northwestern University, and she also graduated locally from UNC Chapel Hill. So thank you, Lori, for being with us. And I believe one of the staff is passing. Oh, no, you've already got it up. Your NC Clean Energy Plan.
I need to get the picture off. Okay, well, I will jump in. I can't see myself anymore, which is probably good. So I'm going to switch gears. This is going to be a very different presentation from what you just heard from Steve. My plan today is to give you an update on the Clean Energy Plan. I believe you heard about it last year. So this is to give you an update on what has transpired in the past year with the plan, what actions have been taken place to begin implementation. So the topics I'll cover, just a real quick overview of the Clean Energy Plan recommendations to just refresh everybody and get on the same page. And then there are 3 recommendations coming out of the plan that I'll give you an update on. The carbon and clean energy policy design recommendation, so the focus on policy, an update on the energy regulatory process recommendation, and then an update on the energy resiliency recommendations. So policy, regulatory, and resiliency are the 3 things we're going to hit on. I'll give you a heads up, there's a lot of information in this presentation, but I'll just go through it and we can take questions at the end. Hopefully there will be a little bit of time left. Okay, so just to refresh on what got the ball rolling on all this, the executive order number 80 actually came out in 2018 in October from the governor. It was named North Carolina's commitment to address climate change and transition to a clean energy economy. So 3 goals were set out for North Carolina to accomplish by 2025. First, reduce statewide greenhouse gas emissions to 40% below 2005 levels. So that was a statewide macro goal. Second, to reduce energy consumption per square foot in state-owned buildings by at least 40% from fiscal year 2002 to 2003. You should probably know the fiscal year starts in July. And third, to increase the number of registered zero-emission vehicles to at least 80,000 by 2025. And at the time, I think North Carolina had about 3,000 on the road. So as part of Executive Order 80, there was produced a North Carolina Climate Science Report, which provided the global state of science, historical changes in North Carolina, and projections for North Carolina. So this report helped create the foundation and basis for, the underpinning essentially for a number of recommendations. And in this report, it was found the large changes in North Carolina's climate are much larger than at any time in the state's history and are very likely by the end of this century under both the lower and higher scenarios. So that report, you can see at the bottom of this screen, there were 4 different ratings, we could say, on how likely these various issues were to occur. So virtual certainty is like 99 to 100% probability of outcome, very likely, 90 to 100% likely, 66 to 100%, and then low confidence. So if you see something coming out of this report that is very likely or virtually certain, it's a pretty good chance that that it's going to transpire. So future global warming or climate change, the most uncertainty here comes from greenhouse gas emissions. So I'm just going to walk us through that chart on the right-hand side. So the orange bar is just natural weather, essentially climate variability. The blue bar is the climate response uncertainty. And then the green bar is emissions uncertainty. So we could say that the green bar, where we see the most variation, is where we have the most potential to influence the direction of that, or to influence change with various emissions policies. So that is one of the findings that came out of the climate science report. So a couple of quick facts on North Carolina's greenhouse gas inventory, just to level set everyone. So electricity is the #1 source of greenhouse gas emissions. You can see that 35%, transportation 32%. That's what led to the zero emission vehicle goal. Industry just a little over 12%, ag 7%, which I actually thought was going to be higher for North Carolina, but it comes in at 7%. Waste just under 6%, commercial just under 4%, and residential 3.5%. So those are sort of the big picture that's going to drive this conversation. So if there's anything else on the slide you want to take in, I'll take a second to let you take a look at it. One thing that you may want to note, as far as why the goal, part of the reason the goal was set at 40%, if you see in the lower right-hand column here, statewide greenhouse gas emission reductions from 2005 to 2017, we were already tracking at 23.7%. So that gave a lot of confidence to say we can get to 40% by 2025 from that 2005 baseline. So we're going to focus on electricity because it is the #1 sector. Just kind of picking up on some of the things that Steve just mentioned, this of course is not as much driven by things that may be happening on site. This is where you're generating emissions on site through industrial processes is not going to be as impacted by electricity. Electricity still is the #1 factor, so that's what we're going to focus on. If you look to the right, this gives some indication of the value of policy in driving emissions reduction. So House Bill 589, as many of you may be familiar with, was put in place to encourage the development of solar in North Carolina. So that could be a range of utility scale, rooftop, community solar, a range of solar applications. And we can see here the expected reduction in greenhouse gas with proper implementation of HB 589 is much greater. So you can see current run rate for 2017 at 10 million, it can get up to 15 million. So this just is an indication of how policy can help drive reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, which is part of the goal with the various policy drivers. So as many of you know, to develop the Clean Energy Plan, there was a lot of stakeholder engagement. I worked with Sushma Mazemore and the whole DEQ team. We did listening sessions and facilitated workshops across the state. You may have participated in some of these yourself. So there were 6 facilitated workshops in Raleigh about every 2 months, and there were about 75 people who showed up 6 times for an entire day. So we had a lot of folks that were very committed, and it was a very diverse group. There were some businesses, NGOs, universities. It was a very diverse group. And then we had 9 regional listening sessions. You can see where those took place. And then a variety of other outreach, as well as an online survey. So over 800 people participated directly in these sessions. And one of the outcomes was a vision for North Carolina's energy future to be a system that is clean, affordable, equitable, reliable, resilient, and efficient. So a lot to aim for there. And the core values to uphold significant and timely decline in greenhouse gas emissions. So that was actually #1, to have a reduction in emissions. Second was affordable electric rates. That's obviously an advantage in North Carolina. We don't want to compromise that. Third, grid reliability. Fourth, expanded clean energy resources and job growth. And then last but not least, equity and environmental justice considerations. So the recommendations coming out of the plan after a year's worth of stakeholder input, three overarching goals. First, to reduce electric power sector greenhouse gas emissions by 70% below 2005 levels by 2030 and attain carbon neutrality by 2050. So for the electric power sector, this is more ambitious than the broad goals set in Executive Order 80. But after the analysis and a year worth of stakeholder feedback, this is what was determined as the goal. Second, to foster long-term energy affordability for North Carolina's residents and businesses by modernizing the regulatory and planning process. So affordability was a key, but it was determined that modernizing regulation and planning had to be in place to accomplish that. And then third, accelerate clean energy innovation, development, and deployment to create economic opportunities for both rural and urban areas of the state. So a lot of work was done looking at how the clean energy sector has driven jobs in every county in North Carolina. So that's a big positive for the clean energy sector. Also important to note, 48% of Fortune 500 companies set carbon reduction targets and energy efficiency goals. And 23% of Fortune 500 companies have made a public commitment they'll be carbon neutral by 2030. So this is important to North Carolina's policy setting and ability to attract these companies, attract them and retain them in North Carolina. These companies are setting these goals, they need to have a framework and environment to be able to achieve them. And these goals are important to their investors, their customers, their employees. And those are some of the motivations for why Fortune 500 companies are setting these goals, in addition to the obvious potential for cost reduction. So the Clean Energy Plan recommendation areas, there are lots of recommendations. I think on the next, I'll just go ahead and go through some of these. The carbon reduction goal, a key part there is to decarbonize the electric power sector. Second, utility incentives and comprehensive system planning. Key to that is modernizing utility tools and incentives and a comprehensive utility planning process. Third, grid modernization and resilience. So the grid must be updated to support clean energy resources, and it must be resilient and flexible. Next, clean energy deployment and economic development. Customer access to clean energy. We hear from big corporations that they want access to clean energy. They want choice. Second, distributed energy resources, interconnected and compensated for value added to the grid, clean energy economic development opportunities. Under equitable and just transition, equitable access and energy affordability, that's a big part of the plan. And I think in today's environment, that's more important than ever. And then just transition to a clean energy economy, essentially making sure that no one is left behind in these changes in terms of jobs, cost, access to choice. And then the last box, energy efficiency and beneficial electrification. And beneficial electrification simply means moving things like automobiles to electrification. Energy efficiency and demand side management programs and electrification strategies. So there's a lot on this page, and I think we have even more check marks, but there's a lot on the page, but that gives you a sense of the various buckets of recommendation areas. And you may be familiar with some of these already, but just to give you the overview. So to implement this, every recommendation was put in one of three buckets: near term, medium term, or long term. And we also looked at who are the action takers, because a lot of times we would hear, well, when is DEQ going to get all this done, or who's funding it? And it's really not as simple as just getting a big check for DEQ to go implement all of this. As you can see, there's a lot of different players. And for every recommendation, we looked at which of these players is needed to make it happen. Some things maybe the governor's office can do through executive order or executive action. Some things have to be done through the Utilities Commission. Some are up to the legislature. Some things can be done by state agencies, whether it's DEQ or Department of Commerce. So, you can go through each of these, but there's a lot of different people and a lot of different players that need to take the ball and run with it. And a lot of that is already happening, which is encouraging to see. So these key recommendations, I'm going to go through each of these three areas in a little bit more detail, but just as an overarching recommendation, to establish a 21st century regulatory model that incentivizes business decisions that benefit both the utility and the public in creating an energy system that is clean, affordable, reliable, and equitable. So three recommendations. First, develop carbon reduction policy designs for accelerated retirement of uneconomic coal assets and other market-based and clean energy policy options. So I'm going to get into what does that mean. Second, develop and implement policies and tools such as performance-based mechanisms, multi-year rate planning, revenue decoupling, that better align utility incentives with public interest. Obviously today, utilities are paid more for the more power that's used, and that's the way the business model is set up. So if the utilities are expected to reduce energy usage, they've got to have the right business model and incentives to make that happen. And then third, modernize the grid to support clean energy resource adoption, resilience, and other public interest outcomes. So the key issues with the grid: being able to attach to clean energy and be resilient. Okay, so we're going to start with policy, and I'll give you an update on what's happening there. There's a lot to look at under policy. So here's an eye chart. So there's a group that has been formed. It's called the A1 group, because that is the A1 is the name of the recommendation in the clean energy policy. So the A1 group is focused on policy, not to be confused with regulatory design. So you can see over on the right-hand side all the different folks that are engaged in this policy workshops. So there's a series of workshops that have been going on all year, and a series of actions and work items to research different policies, to evaluate them, to come back with a set of recommendations. So the goal for this group is to develop carbon and clean energy policy designs and create a report for the governor by December 31st of this year. And the intention is that these policy designs will achieve 70% greenhouse gas reductions by 2030 and carbon neutrality by 2050 for the electric power sector, since that is a direct recommendation from the Clean Energy Plan. There are four key policy pathways that are being evaluated. First, coal retirements, and what is the alternative base case? So that is fairly straightforward. Second is market-based carbon markets. So looking at carbon caps, carbon alliances, carbon trading. What are the options? What are other states doing? What have they learned? What might work for North Carolina? Third, market-based pathway is a carbon price adder. So similar to the concept of a carbon tax, but it's internal and no money leaves the utility. So it's a way of the utility including a added cost for carbon and essentially taking into account external cost of pollution in the decisions around how to allocate resources. So it's not a tax as far as any money leaving the organization, but it's an internal way of putting an additional price on higher carbon alternatives. And then last is a clean energy standard, similar to the renewable portfolio standard, which we have today. It's a little bit broader way of looking at a renewable portfolio standard and looking at, do we need something more than what we have today? Should it be redesigned? So that's the 4 policy pathways that are being evaluated. Then the next bullet is the Clean Energy Plan core values and the role of modeling. So there's a number of things listed here: greenhouse gas reductions, affordability, grid reliability, expanded clean energy resources, compliance, flexibility, and equity. So, social equity, economic equity. So these are the things that are the factors that are used in modeling. So when different options are being evaluated, they're being evaluated based on these assumptions in these key areas. These are the drivers essentially for the modeling to determine which of the pathways is most feasible, which is the most beneficial for North Carolina. And then there have been 3 types of engagement. So stakeholder meetings, you can see the dates here. The most recent one was August 26th. Policy work groups, so 8 meetings there. And then a work group that's doing the technical modeling. So looking at all of these pathways based on these core values listed here. So a lot of work going on in this policy design group. So the second recommendation is around regulatory reform. So very similar approach. I'll go through that. What is happening around regulatory reform? So again, as you can see on the right, big group of people that's been involved in meetings and analysis and putting a lot of work into understanding the regulatory process. So NERP is a new acronym that's been created for North Carolina Energy Regulatory Process, but we can just call it the regulatory process. So the purpose of this group is to produce recommendations for policy and regulatory changes that can be delivered by the participants to the North Carolina General Assembly, the Governor, and the Utilities Commission, and other entities as appropriate. The objectives of this group are to examine alternatives to the traditional utility regulatory model and incentives, carbon reduction policies, and as needed energy market reforms identified by this group. And then second objective, to produce specific policy proposals that participants can work to implement. And as far as the engagements here, there have been a number of workshops, educational webinars, and 3 study groups that are looking at these different options. Okay, so NERP, not to forget, is the Energy Regulatory Process Group. So this regulatory process group has a number of guiding outcomes. As you can see here, improving customer value, improving utility regulation, improving environmental quality, and conducting a quality stakeholder process. So the top 3 of these were affordability and reliability, regulatory incentives aligned with cost controls and policy goals. So again, everybody understands that the cost is critical. And then carbon neutral by 2050. So sort of a mix of protecting what we have as far as cost and aiming for something much more ambitious with carbon neutrality. So there's 4 key policies being evaluated: performance-based rate making, wholesale markets, options for retiring uneconomic assets, and then competitive procurement. So let's start with performance-based rate making. Essentially, we look at electricity generation is declining. Currently, utilities are paid when they generate more electricity, they get paid more. So this is what I mentioned earlier. How do we change those incentives so that what is best for the environment is aligned with the utility's business model. I mean, obviously the utility needs to stay healthy. They provide the grid. We rely on the utilities for that reliability. So how do we protect that business model? And you can see here, I think this is probably pretty obvious what the sources are. Okay, so this is an eye chart, but the key takeaway here is that a lot of energy is wasted. A tremendous amount, about 70% of energy is ultimately wasted. So this is a great place to focus. And where I've put the circle here, if you look at residential, commercial, and industrial, that's a huge part of the waste. Transportation is another issue we're not going to tackle today, but a huge part of the waste comes from these three sectors. And let's see, I am not able to forward my slides. Okay, here we go. So that is a lot of the reason that it makes sense to focus on demand side management. So since that's where a lot of the opportunity is, energy efficiency and demand response. So if we look at essentially being able to focus on lean principles, reducing energy intensity, and saving on energy purchases, we have a lot of opportunity here. And also, so those are technology solutions. Then we have time-based rates and other financial incentives, shifting usage, saving on demand charges, not using during peak periods. So the PBR is performance-based rate making, as we've noted. And what problem is revenue decoupling solving? So it's essentially solving the idea that utilities earn less when there's less generation, which is not what we're aiming for. So they target the throughput, it targets the throughput incentive. It breaks the link between the amount of energy a utility delivers to customers and the revenue it collects. And the utilities no longer have a disincentive to invest in solutions that decrease sales. So you could say they have more of an incentive to invest in solutions that may decrease their sales because their revenue is not as directly tied to that. So, again, energy efficiency and demand response are the key levers here. So the next two charts are very complicated, and so I'm not going to spend too much time on them, but we'll just suffice it to say it's complicated. So I'm just going to skip over this, but the main idea is just decoupling the utilities revenue generation from throughput. So I'm going to also this was in our overall review, examples of residential energy efficiency options, obviously not as relevant for this group, so I'm going to skip that and move to the third recommendation, which is to modernize the grid to support clean energy, resource adoption, resilience, and other public interest outcomes. As we all know, we see it happening right now on the West Coast with the wildfires. The frequency of billion-dollar disaster events is continuing to increase. It's something that we all need to think about. How are we protecting our businesses? How are we protecting our states? So you can see here, North Carolina's billion-dollar disaster events. I mean, we're all aware of what's happened with Hurricane Matthew, Hurricane Dorian. So this is something that as a state, we are looking at how do we get ahead of this? How do we protect ourselves? How do we create the infrastructure to avoid these billion-dollar disasters? So what are the hazards directly affecting the energy system? There's a whole list of non-climate related stressors such as population growth, aging infrastructure, cyber attacks, the rural-urban divide, public health threats, which we've just seen with the pandemic. There's climate stressors, which may, and we've already sort of talked through this, what is virtually certain, very likely. So virtually certain is sea level rise. Very likely is that summer heat will continue to increase. Likely is precipitation will increase and hurricane intensity will increase, as well as severe droughts and inland flooding. So all of these things are risks for North Carolina. And so the policy on resiliency is no uniform methodology or best practice. We don't have, no state utilizes a resiliency metric in regulating utility planning process. And the national associations found that in regulatory proceedings, resilience values for distributed energy resources have only been used qualitatively for decision making. So the bad news is there's not a lot of direction on how to create policies around resiliency. But the good news is that North Carolina can do what we can create what is best for us. And I know from a lot of other work that there are efforts across the nation, across the globe, to get a better sense of how do you put a value on resiliency, how do you justify investments in resiliency, and it's a big topic. So valuing energy resiliency. There's a program that we are working on right now called Planning an Affordable, Resilient, and Sustainable Grid in North Carolina. It's a collaboration between the U.S. Department of Energy, DEQ, UNC Charlotte, and the North Carolina Clean Energy Technology Center. It's building on and contributing to resiliency-related efforts across the country, as you can see here. And the Department of Energy is interested in developing metrics to evaluate the societal and economic impact of inflation-adjusted cost of weather-related power outages, estimated to be about 70 billion annually in the U.S. So essentially, what this is all about is creating metrics so that we can look at how do you incorporate that into a utility's decision to invest in more infrastructure, invest in these things that will make the power grid more resilient. Because today, a lot of these societal impacts are not part of the equation. So that is what this project is aiming to help create. Let's see, I'm going to skip over this. I think we have kind of gone through a lot of this already. So in summary, we've gone through the Clean Energy Plan and what the recommendations are. We've talked about the policy design work underway. We've talked about the regulatory process that's underway. And we've talked a little bit about energy resiliency. I'm not sure I mentioned that we did create a North Carolina Climate Risk Assessment and Resiliency Plan was delivered this year. And that actually also has an entire chapter on equity. And that has laid out a range of recommendations. There's a whole section on energy as well, on specific to the energy sector. So if you have questions, I think I'm finishing up about 10 minutes early here, so I will do my best with addressing questions. And then of course, Sushma Mazemore is also a great resource for answering questions.
All right. Well, so while folks are digesting all of that, there's a lot of great information there and a lot of things that could impact their facility, if not their corporation. I just wanted to say that I know I learned a couple new statistics. 48% of Fortune 500 companies have a carbon energy goal, and 23% are carbon neutral by 2030. I think those are some really aggressive goals. And Lori, I didn't know if you could just speak to those numbers. I'm sure are changing week to week, month to month. Is there a way to track that and kind of keep tabs on seeing how that number will change?
Sure, there are organizations, national organizations that track that. You see things coming out in the news on a regular basis. Walmart has aggressive goals. Amazon has aggressive goals. Google has aggressive goals. Even BP, the oil company, recently came out with some really aggressive goals. So, it's just continually in the news, these major Fortune 500 companies that are setting carbon neutrality goals or renewable energy goals. So I'm not sure the best way to track it other than probably, I can get back to you on that. Ceres is a national organization that tends to look at that. There may be others like the World Wildlife Fund that is looking specifically at companies that, well, part of the role of these national organizations is to encourage companies to set these goals. But I think in many cases, the companies are taking the lead on their own. I can follow up with you and think about what would be the easiest way to keep track of that.
Great, sounds good. And we do have a question here from the audience. Should we expect any near-term state-level spending on new energy incentives? For example, solar or charging stations, et cetera, at businesses?
It's hard to know what will exactly come out of these various work groups. I really don't know that I can speak to whether or not we can expect any near-term incentives, because I think a lot is going to depend on, really on the legislature. Would probably need to approve a lot of that. And that's anyone's guess.
Right, great, thank you. Yeah, I do know that the geothermal incentives were very successful when they were in place. So. And we do have another question here. Is the Clean Energy Plan statutory at this point or still in planning? And then a second part, also, what is the path for it to become law?
Well, the plan is very comprehensive. The plan by itself is not going to become law because there's so many different components to it. There's so many different elements. So there's no one law that's going to encompass the entire clean energy plan. Although as we went through all the various recommendations, it was noted where a recommendation required legislative action or where there was a recommendation that could be addressed through, either a state agency, government, private sector in some cases. But, if you look at a lot of the recommendations, it's not a matter of just having one law passed. Even with, let's take, some of these regulatory issues. Each one would have to be looked at individually and determined, is this the direction we want to go? Or, in the case of regulation, and a lot of that may really fall to the Utilities Commission rather than the legislature. So there's a whole series of actions and a whole series of decision makers that are involved in bringing the Clean Energy Plan to fruition and into implementation.
Great, thank you. We have another question here to see if the Energy Office is working on policies, or just state government in general, working on policies to help industries that want to install renewable energy on site, and they're struggling with their local utility provider because their agreements and contracts make it difficult.
That is a big issue, and there's a lot of work being done on providing more choice. There's a lot of interest in that issue from some of the big energy users, such as a Walmart, Google, etc. So there is definitely, I'd say, growing pressure to provide more choice. And that's going to be, that's probably one that is going to take legislative approval. But I know that there is a lot of work being done to drive for more choice. And when I say more choice, giving you the ability to have, on-site renewable energy. And in addition to just having it on site, in many cases, a company wants to be able to sell back their excess and be paid for it. And all of those are things that are not currently, it's not currently a very favorable environment for it, but there's a lot of work being done to bring together the business voice and elevate the business voice on interest in that. And you know, frankly, it's pretty bipartisan. You know, that's where it just needs the interest in that needs to keep getting elevated.
Excellent, excellent. So I wanted to go back to that Lawrence Livermore National Labs energy flow graph. I think that's extremely powerful. It's actually my background on my laptop, so I have to look at it every day.
Can I go on this?
Sure.
Are you talking about the wasted energy?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, I
right
know.
there. Yeah, that's an extremely powerful graph. Yes. So thinking about all these folks, you know, online that are, you know, kind of in the trenches on the demand side, what are some ways that they can use this, you know, within their plant management or even higher at the corporate level to really help with their, again, you know, very detailed projects and demand side projects?
Well, I mean, if we go, let's see, I'm having a hard time getting, if we go back to, you know, some of the essentially solutions that were laid out, I mean, this are some of the places that I think you can start. When we talk about lean principles, doing more with less, reducing energy intensity, I mean, just energy management essentially on the technology solutions. And then some of the other financial incentives may be more dependent on the utility to put those incentives in place. I mean, especially things like time of use rates. That would depend on whether or not your utility offers that. But the energy efficiency and demand response, I mean, anybody can do energy efficiency. Demand response is a little bit more dependent on whether or not your utility will and give you the benefits from that. I'm not sure if that answered your question as well as you'd like, but
Oh, that's great.
Is there anybody in the audience that may have a suggestion?
It might take folks just a minute to think about that. So if you all do take data like that and talk to your plant management or corporate folks, go ahead and write that in the chat or question area.
Yeah, and I just wanted to interject, Lori, back to that discussion before about businesses having a voice. Is there a way that some of our ESI members can get engaged in the process if they're not already?
There should be. I'm trying to think of these two policy groups, the A1 group and the B1 group, are pretty far down the road. I may have to get back to you on that, Angela. I'm not sure the best way to facilitate that. I think with those two specific work groups, it would be hard to jump in on those at this time. I mean, I can tell you that I work with a lot of businesses, so I mean, folks could let me know and then I could coordinate with, you know, my colleagues, but that's since I have a business background, that's one of the roles I play is to help pull together the business voice. So if there's someone who's particularly interested, they're welcome to contact me and I can think about the best way to get their voice or their point of view integrated into the discussion.
Great, thank you.
Marcia, do we have time? We had a couple responses to that question for the audience.
We got 2 minutes. I think we can go a minute or two over. I think people would value that.
Well, so we have a very loyal subject here saying that their Eaton UPS, their uninterruptible power supply, helps with peak shaving. So that definitely fits in with that chart. And Mike Stowe from Advanced Energy uses that quote unquote the big chart with their end users frequently and looking at process efficiencies and energy intensity as well as demand options. And with that, I think that is the last comments and questions.
All right.
Great.
All
So
right.
we are right on schedule. Lori, thank you again for that update on where we are. What are the next big timelines or due dates for the energy plan?
Are you asking me? So I know that the report to the governor for the policy group is due December 31st. So I would say that is a pretty big, and I believe also with the regulatory group. So that is the next timeline to get those reports done, and then it's in writing. And we'll have to see what comes out of those reports and determine, is it all up to the legislature, or are there steps that can be taken through the Utilities Commission, or are there other ways to move these recommendations forward? I think we'll just have to wait at this point to see what the recommendations are.
Okay. Well, awesome, Lori. Thank you again.
All right. Thank you.
Okay, folks, that's going to wrap up our day 3 of our ESI virtual conference. We're going to be back tomorrow. We'll have our water efficiency panel, a presentation on material handling opportunity chargers, a panel on the circular economy. That was an idea that Scott had come up with that we're running with. And then in the afternoon, we're going to recognize our members, new members, and our renewal conditions, and sort of give you an update on ESI. So thank you for joining us. Please complete the survey again when you leave, and we'll see you tomorrow.